Okay, so we're going to look at a chapter of Fabris tonight and making a couple of assumptions. One, everybody's read it, at least the chapter. Okay, I'm not expecting you to have read the whole thing. Although by this point, most of you should have at least read the theory section of Fabris, the first 30 pages. The second assumption is that you're all prepared to talk about it. I'm going to, of course, ask you for any questions you've got. I'm going to ask you guys questions. I want to get a sense of how you feel the material we learn syncs up with the source texts. All right. I also want to get a sense of how you're understanding the source texts, how you're starting to integrate it in your own what you're doing. All right. So, first off, would anybody like to volunteer to summarize the chapter? Just give me, bullet points or just their sense of what it was. And, not just it's about finding the sword. Anybody want to give it a shot?
I'll give it a shot if no one else is going to volunteer.
Okay. Are you in your PJs? Let's see you.
Finding the sword is a good idea, but finding the sword is also a tempo and a provocation, so you should be careful with how you do it. He talks a little bit about what being found means, situated so that you're stronger and so that you cannot be pushed away. He talks about ways in which your opponent might deal with you finding their sword, the ways in which they can either take the tempo of your find or, take the tempo of your find in various ways. Then he discusses ways you can deal specifically if they use the tempo to step in. That if they advance, whether you're on the inside or the outside, that's a great tempo to strike. Here's how you can do that. Talks about why you don't want to make contact, why touching the swords is a bad idea. I think those were the main points I sort of highlighted. I'm sure I missed some stuff.
Okay. All right. So let me throw out something else. Preferably somebody else answer. What would you say are the two main points of the chapter, or rather the two techniques around which the entire chapter revolves? One's a gimme, but the other not necessarily.
I mean, it seems pretty clear that you must make sure the forte of your blade is to your opponent's dead away, I think.
Okay, you can be a little bit more general when we say technique. What am I doing? Not how I'm doing it, but what am I doing?
Oh, I guess you're just making sure your opponent can't use their sword to hurt you while you can hurt them with your sword.
Okay. All right. Now I see in the chat, Katrina has mentioned keeping the sword free, and that's very good. That's basically the second thing I was looking for. So when I ask questions like this, conceptual questions, everybody often thinks there's a trick to it. That I'm saying, okay, so if I'm asking, what are you doing? Then people are going to say, give me all the nuts and bolts of what they're doing. And so, this is not Jeremy, right? I can barely see you. Hi, yeah, okay, hi. Good to see you. If you just said the first technique is finding the sword. Frankly, that's it. I mean, it's in the title, but my point is that's obviously the central technique of he's discussing in the chapter, or the central concept, if you will. And as Katrina pointed out, keeping your sword free is the second one. They are very closely related, but you may, did anybody notice how much time Fabris spends talking about keeping your sword free in the chapter as opposed to finding the sword? I'd say about a third of the chapter is about finding the sword and how you go about it, and then it's all about keeping him from finding yours. And that is, to my mind, what really crystallizes his entire system. We know the importance of finding the sword. We know that it's a fundamentally a defensive action. That it we know that it is crucial for an effective attack to keep yourself from getting hit at the same time. But throughout Fabris's entire system is the central concept of a free blade, a blade that is floating in the air completely under his own control. And he talks about, as Dan pointed out, many dangers besetting your own blade as you go to find his, and how to avoid it, all right? Or at least gives you some ideas of how to. All right, everybody following me so far? Okay, so those are the two main issues in the chapter. And it's a pretty short chapter. The first 30 pages of the book, the theory section, which is really where all the meat of the book is. It's not extraordinarily dense. There's a lot that may be very unfamiliar to people approaching fencing for the first time, but he lays it out in fairly discrete chunks, so it's so he's not overwhelming you. And I have to point out also that this is greatly helped by Tom Leone's translation. Let me just show you something if some of you have not seen this before. Hang on a second. I am looking for. Okay, 1 second. It's not there. I think. Here we go. All right. So here's Tom Leone's translation, right? And it's nicely paragraphed. He even gives us bullet points every once in a while. For instance, right here. Right? Am I still sharing the screen? Can everybody see this? Yeah. Okay. And then, let's see if I can. I had this up. Let's put this over here. Sorry about this, guys. I thought I had something up, but I didn't. And I just lost that. Okay. Okay, so just give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so what I want to show you was, okay, so here we have Tom Leone's translation. And here I'm going to show you the original, and I want you to see what it looked like. This is what the original looks like. If you look closely, you're going to have a really hard time finding punctuation in there. They're basically single-spaced run-on sentences. He wrote relatively clearly for his day, but man, did he not know how to construct a book. Now, this is going to look extraordinarily daunting to somebody approaching this material for the first time. And we, as I said, we have Tom Leone to thank that he put it in a readable form. All right, so just wanted to share that for a second. Okay, where did everybody go? Okay, so like I was saying, all of this, the theory section of the book is in fairly readable chunks, but it's deceptive because you take a deep dive, which I've been doing for the last 20 years, and you unearth a lot of really good nuggets, especially if you treat it as a hypertext. All right, this I think makes perfect sense, but then you relate it to 3 or 4 things farther in the book, and then all of a sudden it opens up a whole other world for you. So all that to say is that it looks deceptively simple, but it bears repeated reading. Okay, so did anybody find anything in this chapter that was new to them, that they didn't think they'd encountered before in class, or that looked either that or looked different from what they've learned? Anybody at all?
It looked very similar to me.
I beg your pardon?
It felt very similar to the stuff you have been teaching. There's at least one place where I don't recognize what Fabris is saying compared to what you show us in class, but I think that's just because I don't recognize it.
Well, okay. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. If there's something that does not look, that you don't recognize from what we're seeing in class, let's hear about it.
Page 16, no matter how little space.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So he's describing how the opponent is going to take advantage of your tempo.
Right.
And the opponent has a very particular attack he's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's what you do for us in class. I don't think that's the drills you set up.
Okay, well, actually, this does come right back to certain specific things we have done in class. So what do you think he means by how little space between the 2 points?
I read that as straightforward English. There's X number of inches between the points, and make a judgment on that.
What points are we talking about?
I think the 2 lead points.
Death. Pardon?
Where death lives.
Okay, so the points of the swords, right? Okay, so if you look at it 3-dimensionally, how does where is he putting the 2 points? He's putting them right in front of each other, beside each other, what?
Well, the thing he's setting up here is the points are right next to each other, centimeter. They're just super close.
Okay.
Because he's setting up a limiting case.
Mm-hmm.
But then so I'm okay with my understanding of the first sentence. No, the first line, sorry. Because I think I understand he's setting up a limiting case.
Okay.
But then forming an angle and moving in. The moving in part, sure, you've taught that.
Yeah.
Setting up the angle and then moving opposite of the sword.
Okay.
That's a funny, we don't really do that.
Okay. So let me describe something and you see if it seems familiar to you. So actually, let me bring up a whiteboard here. Okay, so we've got, here's the situation. So we have our opponent is pointing at me and I'm pointing at him, right? Now, the space he's talking about is this space, right? Right in here. And we know space is time, right? It takes time. If I'm going to take my sword and go to cross his, it takes time to get there. If it's a tiny space, it's a tiny time, but it's still a tempo. Hang on a second. Let me get this over here. Okay, so. Okay. Sorry. Oh boy, thought I had control of this. Thought I was using the whiteboard controls. I was using the chat, the shared, the annotate controls. Okay. All right. So let's drop that. Okay, so. Okay, so he's coming at you here, you're here. Now it takes time for you to get from there to there, right? Now, as he goes to there, as I'm going to there, that's an angle across his sword, right? Now, how does he cancel that out? I mean, he can do one of several things, right? And obviously we know that a cavazione under my point is one of them. But what if he doesn't want to do that? Sorry, I'm there, I'm over his sword. What if he just creates an angle of his own? Right? Now, I'm not quite pointing at him, but he can be pointing at me like that. All right. So what did I do? If he's finding me on the inside, I turn to seconda. He's trying to cross my blade. I cancel that out by turning to an angled seconda, which parallels his blade and points straight at me. That's the angle that Fabris is talking about. Now, we have done this when we have looked at the uses of seconda. As I turn to seconda and cancel out his find, and at the same time, I move my body over to the other side away from his point, what have I set up? Jim?
Void.
A void, a specific kind of void that we call what?
El Paso Soto. I mean,
It could be a pasado soto. We've done it mostly by yield, right? I am yielding around his sword with seconda, right, to avoid his find and get my body out of the way so I can simply pass all the way to his body, as Fabris says. Okay? So that's all he's talking about. It's, this is obviously a quite common occurrence because, and if you've ever fenced Alicia, you know that it's a common occurrence. This is a common occurrence because he puts it right at the top of his list of things to watch out for. Now, he starts off by saying that you want to make sure that when you start finding his sword, your sword is not that far away from his. Right? If, you know, the more space there is here, the more of a tempo there is for him to react. Right? But even if it's that close, I go to cross his blade, even in that little time, he can set up this because all it is a little turn of the hand and a bending of the wrist, right? I'm moving my point across his blade. He's just simply moving his hand, cancels it out, use the same tempo to take his body off the side, and he's in. So there is the big danger that Fabris is concerned about in this case.
So the movement of the body opposite direction of the point.
Yep.
So that's
Yep.
just setting up a secundo.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. But because if I'm here, right, and I turn a seconda and I move my body this way, and your point's going that way, I should already be into my pass going that way, right? And as you started saying, it's a void, right? But it's a void around with my arm and sword around his sword, rather than ducking under or calving. That makes sense?
I read it as a sort of destreza technique where you walk into the sword.
No, it's not. and they don't really do that in Destreza either. But you'll frequently come across Fabre saying things like, and pass all the way to his body, or go to his body, as he does in this chapter. And that's basically what he means. He is, even though he spends, even though lunging is the primary attacking technique, he actually favors the pass quite a bit. And if you look at his chapter on lunging, he spends about 2/5 of it talking about the lunge and 3/5 of it talking about the pass instead. And one of the things he likes about it is that it gets you past his point really quickly and all the way to his body, where he can't hurt you, unless, of course, he outweighs you by 50 pounds, or he has a dagger. But of course, once you get to his body, as we know, we don't stop there, right? We either run him through and keep going, or we get parried and keep going, or we grapple him. It really all depends on what's happening in that tempo. So anytime he says, and go to his body, he means get past his point and go take him down, either with your sword or with your own body. Okay. Okay. Now, let's continue along that line of inquiry. Let's go back to the text. So like I said, he starts off talking about be careful that your point is not so far from his sword that you give him a huge tempo in which to do this. Then he says, even if it's really close, you still have to be careful. And really, the main takeaway here is that anything that you do, however small it is a potential tempo, and you always have to treat it that way. All right? Even if all I'm doing is I'm in guard, I'm in narrow space, and I simply move my point across his, that is still something that he can use. So I always have to be ready for his reaction and treat it proactively. I never just move to get to a certain point. I move to get to a certain point, or rather I move to make him do something. If he doesn't do something, then I end up at that certain point. All right. Now, so that to me is the tactical takeaway from these two paragraphs, even though he's speaking about specific techniques. Now, if you want to avoid this situation, what does he say? Lay the groundwork, assess the distance, figure out the time it takes you to accomplish your task, which is to find his sword. Move cautiously so as to be able to make a quick change in case he moves. Now, if he, let's say you are finding him on the inside, and he creates that angle of seconda that cancels out your find, right? You not only are no longer crossing over his sword, you're running parallel to his, but he's also taking his sword away from you and keeping your point on, his point on you. Right? So what does he want you to do? Right? Well, basically, continue your motion, but with different parts of your sword. Your points now, you were aiming your point across towards his sword to find it. You redirect it to his body and let your hand or your hilt go to his sword instead. Right? This is the first bullet point. If you are on the inside, push or thrust the opponent while putting your hilt on that part of the sword where you originally intended to put that point. Does this look like to anybody like something we've done in class? Okay, then I'll show you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned something about like the silver path. You want to push your hilt towards your friend.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the standard attack. And this is not something that we've done in the taster class, but here it is. Anybody from, sorry, Nat, what are you showing me?
Oh, I actually was drawing little diagrams in this book, so it looks like that.
Let me see. Can you pin your video or?
Well, I don't know how to do that.
Okay, never mind. Okay, well, if you can see what I'm showing you, tell me if this looks like what you just drew. Right?
Yes.
So here, this is sorry. This is me right here where I'm pointing, or here, shall I actually annotate that? This is me, right? I was on the inside, I went to find his sword. See, this guy is now in seconda. That's what he did as I went to find his sword. So instead of putting my sword that way, I put it that way and take my hand and put it there where I was trying to cross his blade. And now with my hand right here, that gives me a shield to be able to push away his blade, even if it's strongly angled towards me, which if I had crossed him with my blade, I wouldn't have been able to do that because he simply would have wrapped around my blade. All right. Now, this is something that we have done in class, by the way.
Yes, it's very hard because you're doing two things at once. You're aiming at the chest to kill, and you're using your hilt as a...
Well, Jim, isn't that exactly what we do every time we attack?
Poorly. Some of us do it very good, yes.
Okay, isn't that exactly what we're trying to do every time that we attack? I mean, even if we're attacking through the sword, right? We are putting as Jeremy mentioned, we're following that silver path. We're crossing his blade, but then putting our hilt to where our swords were, where our blade was crossing him as we redirect our point. This is exactly the same thing, except that we are not actually crossing his blade, because his blade has faded away and is no longer able to be crossed. Or rather, it can be crossed, but there's no way I would hit him at the same time because my point would be going off into space. Everybody see that? Okay, so this is another great thing about Fabris, by the way. He gives you all these little tidbits in his theory section, all these little techniques, and then you will find them in the action plates later on. For the most part, they will. If you pay attention, you will see exactly what he's talking about. Another example. So the second bullet point. Let me get rid of that. Okay, the second bullet point is the exact same situation on the outside. All right. I'm on the outside. I go to find his sword. He cancels it out by forming an angle. This time, presumably in quarta, right? And in order to keep him from hitting me, say with a girata around, aiming his sword around me, and for the new guys joining us for the first time, a girata is basically just voiding your body off to the inside line. Instead, as he is trying to do that, again, I put my hilt to his blade, and drop my point in towards his body. Now Fabris doesn't exactly show that, but he shows something that looks like that very much. And it's right here. So here's one of his plates that shows a passata sotto, the pass under the sword. If you picture, all right, 1 second here. If you picture this hand right there as inside the opponent's blade rather than outside it, that's pretty much where you would have ended up when he tried to angle around your find, if you reach out with your hand to meet his blade. So it's basically just the same thing you're doing on the inside, except that you're using a different guard and a pass in. Everybody see the similarity? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, so I wanted to address that first section in detail. Does anybody else have anything that that jumped out at them as either very similar to what we do in class or not at all similar to what we do in class? Or something that just...
I had a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I had a question. It's very similar to what you're describing. A little bit earlier on page 15, Faber says, "Be advised that a sword is always stronger on the side to which it points,"
Yep.
which I understand and I think is the principle illustrated here.
Mm-hmm.
But then he says, "If you wish to situate your own sword on the stronger side of your opponent's, you have to place your body and your sword so that your sword is as strong as his.
Right.
This is mostly a matter of how you bend your wrist." And I was trying to think, well, in this situation where, let's say someone is in like a very aggressively angled seconda, which is very strong to the inside, why would I want to place my sword on the side that's strong instead of going around to the weak side of it?
Okay. Excellent question. Fabris has got a little illustration for that, as he intimates right there at the end of the paragraph. So, well, first of all, why would you want to do it? The best answer is that you don't necessarily want to do it, but maybe you don't really have any option. You may be trying to get to the outside of that strongly angled seconda, but he's not letting you. Every time you try cavazione, he does a counter cavazione, or he keeps moving to the side, to one side to keep you very much on his strong side. In other words, the simplest solution is not always available to you. He may be actively, trying to keep you from doing that. Or maybe you just decide, he's doing this, he expects me to do that, I'm gonna try something else and throw him off his game. So both, in terms of simple technique and also in terms of tactics, you may have a number of reasons why you would end up in that situation. Now, what he's demonstrating is we've talked about counter guards. We've done a little bit of work with counter guards, at least some of you have. And a counter guard is basically just placing your sword and body in such a way as to completely shut out their point from the line of attack. In other words, they are no longer pointing at you, and your structure is in the way of bringing their point back to you. Ideally, a counter guard completely removes his point from the line, but as in all things, there is always degrees of success. And here he says that in order to demonstrate the importance of the strength of the sword, the angular strength of the sword, he refers you to a plate that looks like this. There. This is one of his versions of quarta. I suggest you pay more attention to the guy on the left because the guy on the right is a little bit the sword, it looks a little funky. What he's talking about is very much the guy on the left. So you see how the sword is pretty much angled that way. And you see the nice straight structure between sword and arm. And this is what he's talking about bending, how he's talking about bending the wrist. When he's talking about bending the wrist, he's actually talking about what we call straightening it out into a good structure. Because when you cock the wrist to align the sword of the arm, you're actually breaking the wrist in an unnatural way, as I'm sure all of you have noticed. So this, quote, bend of the wrist is what straightens out his sword and creates a very strong quarta on the inside. Whereas quarta tends to break to the outside, creating a weak side on the inside. Now you're redirecting it to the inside and strengthening that inside. So this is how Fabris would tell you to counter that angled seconda. Now, for whatever reason, you're stuck on that side, and you have to create as strong a guard as possible to make sure he doesn't hit you. Because what he wants to be able to do is either wrap around your sword or push your sword out of the way as he attacks. And this, of course, is going to keep him from doing that. But the other thing it will do is if you absolutely need to parry his angled seconda, this is going to allow you to do it. You may need to move your hand more than you want to, but you're able to parry it. Whereas if you keep your sword pointed at him in more of a natural quarta, there's no way. Yeah, you'd never be able to, unless you got your hilt to his blade, as in the previous demonstration. So this is how you would situate. This is before swords ever cross. This is you see what he's doing with his sword. You want to go find his sword. You're stuck on the wrong side of it. You obviously want to go to the outside of it, but you can't. So you create the strongest possible position on the inside to be able to shut that down before the swords actually come into contact. All right. Yeah, so Tony, I know I kind of went further afield than what you were asking, but does this make things a little clear?
Very, very much so. I have my sword in hand as you're describing it, and just moving my wrist and how in the way you're describing it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, cool. Okay, and you know, those are actually the two spots in the text where evidently I anticipated the most questions. So thank you, guys. Anything else? Anything else people notice?
Actually, I just have a question about this angled guard. I'm having a little bit of problem visualizing it. I don't think we covered too much in the beginner course. Is like the false edge of the blade facing the opponent's blade in this case? I'm not really sure.
No. Okay. So you're talking about the guard we're looking at right now.
Yeah.
Okay. So first off, you need to realize that the two fencers are doing the exact same thing. They're not facing off against each other. This is simply a depiction of the same guard from two sides. All right? That's how he starts off showing all of his guards. And because the models twitched or the artist didn't quite understand what he was seeing, very often they don't look perfectly symmetrical, and they're not, you know, one side is frankly a better demonstration of the technique than the other. Here, let me see if I can get back to my whiteboard. 1 second here. Okay, so new share. Okay, and let me get rid of all that. Oh, this is the Zoom whiteboard. I get it. Okay, I thought I was using my whiteboard. Okay, So get rid of all that. Okay, so we've got, let's see. Hello. Okay, so we've got, oh crap. Just want to draw. Okay, so we have my opponent's sword here, and I'm here. All right. He creates, okay, this is his arm, and he comes at me creating this angle. All right. Now, all he's doing there is making it difficult for me to find him in where I am. All right. Because I want to cross over his sword, but as you can see, if I move towards his sword, I'm not crossing him, I'm going parallel to it. And if I cross him, the more I try crossing him, the less I'm pointing at him, which is over here. I used to be able to draw. It's before it's back when I used a pen and pencil. And he's still pointing at me. All right, so I haven't really accomplished much. Now, he creates that angle towards my blade. And what I'm going to do is, okay, I'm here. And here's my arm, there's my elbow, and I'm going to create a strong straight line towards him. Now, in a way, what I'm doing is I am presetting a parry. Right? He wants to come in this way, and I'm already angled towards his blade so that I can meet it and then deflect it. All right. So in other words, all I'm doing is he's giving me a strong angle on the inside, and I'm making sure I give him just as strong an angle as he's giving me. He's coming at me in a seconda, and the natural strength of seconda is on the inside because of the natural angle of the wrist. That's just again, there's my arm, here's my hand, right? If I just take my hand and put my sword in it, it tends to go that way, right? If my hand is pronated in seconda. That's why this angle here is we call a natural angle. It's the way the sword wants to behave in a certain guard. What we tend to do is we straighten it out to create a straight line. But if I let my wrist go, just bend naturally, it's going to go off that way. Or if I turn my hand up, supinating it, it's going to go that way. All right, I do hope that my draftsmanship is not completely flummoxing you. You still with me, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Okay. So all I'm doing is here. Let's look at Quarta. With Quarta, here's my body. Here's my arm crossing my center line. Right, I'm facing this way. My arm crosses my center line. I turn my palm up, and my point goes towards him. So this is the natural way that Quarta behaves. Right, that makes Quarta stronger on this side, weaker on this side. So if I simply cock my wrist and create a straight line between my arm and my sword, pointing it that way, I've now made this my strong side and this my weak side. Because this is the way I'm now pointing. And I have a fairly strong structure that's pointing it that way. That work for you?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, cool. Okay. Cool. Anybody else? Okay. So let's see. So what do you guys notice about, he gives you a number of actions in this chapter, right? As Dan started pointing out, you know, the basic action is finding the sword. Then there's he can do this, that's an action. I can do this in response to that, that's an action. If he actually succeeds in finding me, I can do this, another action. What is the common thread to all these actions? What is the absolute requirement to make these actions work?
But I guess is you need a good tempo to get the action.
The simplest answer is usually correct.
Know what he can do.
Good one, yes. That's always very useful. But even if you know what he can do, if you perform an action, but assume that's the end of it, right? I'm going there, and that's all I need to do. Obviously, you know, I want to continue and hit him, but if I consider my action as having an end point, then that's exactly where it will end, regardless of what he does. Every time I make a motion, I am giving him a tempo opportunity. So that's what we started looking at with that idea of there's space between the weapons. There's a tempo that he can take to do that, right? So the remedy that Fabris tells you is, all right, before you do that, as Mark said, be aware that he can do that. And be aware exactly when he's going to do it. So in other words, I'm not going to go find him. I'm going to go make him do that so I can do that. So in other words, every action that you perform has got to have a follow-through. Doesn't mean you're going to do it. It just means that you're assuming he's going to do something in response to you. So you're either going to perform your first action and complete it, or perform your first action, and as you expected, he does his thing, so you continue into your next thing. In a way, this is kind of a minimalist version of what Rob was talking about with first and second intention in his first lecture a couple of weeks ago. There, he was specifically referring to the first intention is the attack, and the second intention is the follow-through. But if you just take that back a bit and treat the finding of the sword as its own little world, my first intention is to find his sword, but I damn well have got a second intention planned for when he moves. And again, it's all a matter of tempo. Whenever I move, I give him a chance to respond. Whenever he responds to me, he gives me a chance to respond to him. And without that, none of what I do is going to work. Even with the simplest action of finding his sword, tempo is key. You can think of, even if I'm out of the measures, I'm gaining the advancing measure, which is where I can first find his sword. If he's standing still and I step in to find his sword, there's a tempo. He can't hit me in that tempo, but he can gain advantage over me. So I step in to find him in the advancing measure, and if you've been with me for a while, you know that I refer to that first find as a provocation. Provocation just means I'm making him do something so I can do something else. So I step in, I give him a tempo, he takes the tempo to respond to me, and I make my move. And whether that move is a strike or simply gaining measure or gaining better advantage, doesn't matter. I'm taking advantage of whatever he gives me. So buried in this chapter is the assumption that everything you're doing pays attention to tempo, to the tempo that you're giving and the tempo he's giving you. None of it works without it. Now, which brings us to, we're running short of time here, which brings us to the second part of the text, which is the second concept that we talked about, which is keeping the sword free. Without that keeping the sword free, you are not going to take advantage of tempo. Let's see, so here's a section where he talks about finding the sword, and basically starting with the 5th paragraph right here, this is all about keeping the sword free, right? All this I'm going to find his sword, and now, be careful that as you try to find him, he may find you instead. And then it's all about moving through and making sure that he does not find you, or that your sword stays unmolested. He goes right after the first section we talked about, where you're defeating his yield. He starts talking about never touching his blade. And if you've read through the entire book, you realize that don't touch his blade Fabris almost uses it as punctuation. You do this and this and this, and don't touch his blade. You do that and don't touch his blade. Because touching his blade means losing tempo. It means binding your sword to his. It means losing control of your own sword. And not just not touching a sword, but again, giving attention to tempo. If I move my sword and I'm simply looking to complete that action of finding the sword, whatever he does, he may bind me as I'm finishing. If that first action had that end point in my mind, then my sword is no longer free. But if I'm moving and he goes to bind me, and I'm able to redirect and take that tempo instead and free mine, I'm still free. He says a few paragraphs down, he gives you a couple of things you can do, right? You can yield, which is exactly what the opponent did to me in the first paragraphs. You can simply lower your point. Here's an example of simply lowering your point. There's one of Fabris's variations on terza. Now, this is a fairly extreme action, but you'll notice that I'm lowering my point, and lowering the point, of course, means I'm not as protected by my sword. So what do I do at the same time? Anybody?
You lean back, or
I lean back. I take my body. What's that?
Void, right, left, back.
Well, yeah. Well, we're assuming he hasn't attacked yet. In a way, this is a void, right? I am voiding my body backwards. In other words, if I do anything with my sword that does not protect me, and remember that in this case, he's pointing at me, right? He's trying to find my sword. I drop my point to free mine. If I do anything that does not protect me from his sword, I've got to move my body out of the way, which is exactly what I did, or exactly what he did when he yielded around my blade in seconda and took his body off to the other side. And that's key to keeping your sword free, always knowing when your action does not protect you. So you have to coordinate the actions between sword and body, okay? Which is a very, very Fabrician concern. I think you've heard me say a number of times that Fabris's fencing is a full body exercise. Right? And we're talking about Fabris, and we're talking about his style, and the Fabris postures, the forward lean. This is not central to it. It's a posture that he favors, but it's not. But the actions he performs, the concerns he has about guard and tempo and all that is independent from the actual form of the guard. All right? So for people who are doing the capo ferro stance, all of this still applies. So what's the advantage of what just happened here, where I dropped my point? Is that if he is gung-ho to find my sword and my point suddenly disappears under his blade, what's he going to try to do?
He's going to try to follow it.
He's going to try to follow it. And when he tries to follow it, what is he giving me?
A tempo.
A tempo, right. So look at it this way. He finds me, I drop my point, he drops his sword to find me, and I, in that exact same motion, strike through his sword. And that's, again, an example of every little thing I do is either offering him a tempo or setting up a follow through. Right? If I just dropped my point and stopped there, you know, with no other thought than to free my sword, he goes to find me, and I'm back at square one. Now I've got to free my sword again. But if I drop my point to draw him down and strike as he does so, then I just solved the whole problem. And that is really, I'm not going to say it's what sets Fabris apart from everybody else, but it's what sets his instruction apart. He is always extremely concerned with the tempo potentialities of every single action. Every time you move with the smallest possible action, it's what can he do in that, and how can I take advantage of it? What am I offering him when I make a move? What is he likely to do, and how can I take advantage of it? As long as my sword is completely free and under my control. Right. That work for everybody? Okay. So we're ending the hour. Does anybody else have any final questions about the text or anything I've said, or any observations about the text that came up for them? Okay.
We've been having.
I beg your pardon?
It's all been pretty consistent with the lessons you've been teaching.
Okay.
Anyone else who sort of has the same kind of language around the same period when it comes to the approach?
Really?
I'm not sure how much people talk about it.
Okay, so here's the really interesting thing. This finding the sword is very central to Italian, at least in northern Italian fencing of the period. No, nobody else really talks about it. Or rather, nobody else really goes into it the way that Sal does. Capoferro Capoferro basically gives us what I call the basic attack sequence. Right? He finds the sword from a step out of measure. He pushes the sword farther in as he steps into measure. He strikes. He gets out. He talks about what he refers to as stringere, which literally loosely translates as scraping, which the term he uses for finding the sword. It's the same technique, it's the same action. Giganti is very concerned with counter guards, but he pretty much conflates the idea of counter guard with the idea of finding the sword. So his counter guard always finds the sword. He establishes that right at the beginning, and then he gives you a list of techniques which always start with find your sword, then do this. Alfieri, about 30 years later, pretty much the same thing, except that he is in love with his mixed guard, which he says he invented, which I doubt it. He doesn't really talk so much about finding the other guy's sword as forming your mixed guard, which I assume automatically finds the sword.
He talks about gaining a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's a synonym for finding. That's the thing. When you read these books, you got to remember there was no technical vocabulary. They were making it up as they were going along. So
Yeah.
Capoferro has his stringere word. Fabris has trovare di spada, finding the sword, and he uses that fairly consistently, except when he says something like gaining or acquiring, or occupying, which he starts off the chapter with. I think Giganti mostly uses gaining. Alfieri uses gaining. It's the same thing. Like I said, this is an integral part of Northern Italian fencing. It basically, everybody's teaching the same thing, except that Fabris is the one who actually goes into the nuts and bolts and into all of the tactical ins and outs of it. So is everybody teaching this? Yes. Is everybody teaching it? No. So, and this is why Fabris is the primary text for our curriculum, because it's not replaceable in this time period.
Yeah, I'm just
80 years later, in Rome, or Rome or Napoli, you have Marcelli. 40 years, 50 years earlier, you have Della Gocchie and Vigiani. And this period, you pretty much got Fabris if you want somebody to actually explain things to you. And that's why we're looking at him right now. Okay. So, anybody else? Okay, so I just want to there's this little caveat at the end of the chapter that I wanted to point out. This should also sound familiar even if all you've done it so far has been my taster class. He tells you, and let's actually read it off the text. If you be careful that as you proceed to find the opponent's sword, your point does not advance so much in the desire to strengthen your sword that the opponent can deceive you by bypassing your point on either side before you can straighten it against him. Anybody tell me what that sounds like? Jeremy, how about you? This should be pretty familiar to you.
I suppose if you take the point off your opponent, that's probably not the best thing to do.
Well, obviously. So keeping the point on your opponent, what drill have we done where that has been the main focus? Or rather, what game have we played? Anybody else?
Yeah, the thug game. Thug
Yeah.
Fencer.
Thug and fencer game. So yeah, you want to keep your point on him. And of course, when you find the sword, you are to a certain extent taking your point a little bit away from him. So which is why when you find him, you want to keep it as much as possible in his presence. But notice your point does not advance so much in the desire to strengthen your sword. So in other words, if I'm reaching into his sword, pushing my point forward to find him, that gives him more of an opportunity to void my point. Well, again, we've seen this in the thug and fencer game, right? When you let him get too close and he just kind of like spins around your point, that where I make the point of, all right, now do the same thing, but use your footwork to keep him far enough away from your point so he can't do that. In other words, yes, you need to find his sword, but you always need to keep in mind the first directives, which are keep your point on him to keep him away from you, and keep him far enough away that he can't dodge, right? Which is why voids are most effective when you attack him and your point comes towards him, and then he can simply slip away from it. If he were to void my point, when my point was still too far away, I could track him, right? So the closer I am to him, the easier it is for him to avoid, whether or not I'm attacking him, which of course is exactly what my opponent was doing in the early part of the chapter when I was going to find him and he was dodging around, right? So it comes back to the basics of proper guard, the function of the proper guard, and proper use of measure. All right, so there's a lot of juice in this chapter. So all the chapters and all the action plates, for that matter, always bear a more than one read. Just wanted to put that out there. Okay, guys, I guess we are gone. We have gone over. We're out of time. So if nobody's got anything else, we'll call it a night.
What are the plate numbers?
The plate numbers. You mean all the plates I showed you?
Yes.
Okay, so sorry. We have, so this one is plate 11. It's in the first plates, which are the guards. This one, the strongly angled quarta, is plate 16. It's also in the guard ones. Let's see, this one, I believe this one is plate 36 into the action plates. And then the last one I showed you, this one here is plate 41. And no, I don't have them all perfectly memorized. I know that because I had to dig them out earlier today. Okay. Yeah, let's see, it's chat. 11, 16, 36, 41. You got it, Scott. Sorry, John. Okay. Okay, guys. So I recommend you keep reading. I'll come up with another assignment for next week. And if you have started to work on your homework for Saturday, please drop it off in the Dropbox as soon as possible so I can get a look at it. All right. Okay, guys. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining in, and I will talk to you soon.